These are the planes that won the Battle of Midway, that bombed the heart out of Hitler's Germany. The planes that fought the air war over the jungles of Indochina and the deserts of Iraq. These are the planes that define the meaning of air power. These are the legends of air combat. The North American P-51 Mustang was one of the greatest warplanes of all time. It was also the best American fighter of World War II. The airplane played a crucial role in the air war over Europe and was decisive in securing Allied air superiority over the continent. A major element in the new German concept of blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, was the destruction of an enemy's air strength at the start of a campaign. This then allowed the Germans to use most of their air power in support of ground forces. The Germans launched their offensive in the West on May 10, 1940. Quickly outflanked and caught in a giant pincer movement, the British and part of the French forces in northeast France retreated to the Dunkirk pocket. From there, in a daring sea rescue, many escaped to Great Britain. British and French air forces fought valiantly in the air to stem the Nazi invasion. They paid dearly for their efforts, suffering horrendous losses. Up to June 5, 1940, when the RAF was withdrawn from the French theater, the Royal Air Force had lost 959 aircraft over France, including 432 Hurricane and Spitfire fighters. By the end of June, when France finally capitulated, the French had lost 892 aircraft. Most of the survivors, those that had not escaped to North Africa, were scrapped after the German victory. The French Air Force had virtually ceased to exist. The British were in equally dire straits. By the end of the evacuation from Dunkirk, RAF Fighter Command had been reduced to just 475 serviceable single-engine fighters, including 179 Hurricane and 205 Spitfire aircraft. Great Britain was now on its own, under the leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
Northolt, Kenlip, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, North Weald, Debden. Will you warn your controller that this looks like yet another attack on airfields?
After their defeat of France, the Germans pressed forward with plans for a seaborne invasion of Great Britain. To succeed, the Germans first had to eliminate the Royal Air Force. Fighting to protect their own country and aided by radar, the pilots of the RAF defeated the Luftwaffe in a multi-phase battle between July and October 1940. This victory is now known as the Battle of Britain. Notwithstanding their victory, the British lost 1,004 single-engine fighters during the battle. Despite accelerated production, airplane stocks were at a low ebb, and many factories had been damaged. By December, the British could field only 1,064 single-engine fighters. Huge efforts were made to build up fighter command as rapidly as possible, both from British production and from orders placed with American manufacturers. In January 1940, in response to an acute shortage of aircraft, the British government established the British Direct Purchase Commission. Headquartered in New York, the Commission's task was to arrange for the production and purchase of American-built planes to supplement Britain's domestic production. At the time, none of the American fighter aircraft in production met British standards. The Curtiss P-40 came close, but the Curtiss-Wright plant that was building that plane was already operating at full capacity, so additional supplies were limited. The Commission approached North American Aviation with a request that they manufacture the P-40 for the Royal Air Force under a license from Curtiss-Wright.
So the fellow that was the president of North American, a fellow by the name of Kindleberger, he met with the Brits and said, yes, we can build P-40s for you. He said, let us build an airplane for you, which will be better than the P-40. So the Brits took a chance on that.
Designated the NA-73X, the new plane would become the legendary P-51 Mustang. In March 1940, Great Britain ordered 320 of the new fighters from the North American Aviation Corporation. In September, an additional 300 aircraft were added to the original order. Designated the Mustang Mark I, the name had been chosen by a member of the British Purchasing Commission. The resulting NA-73X prototype of the Mustang first flew on October 26, 1940, only 178 days after the signature on the contract. The Mustang was an advanced form of the modern low-wing monoplane fighter of all-metal construction. The engine was the Allison V1710, a liquid-cooled V12 unit driving a 3-blade propeller. This combination provided very good performance at lower altitudes. However, the engine was fitted with only a single-speed supercharger, and above 15,000 feet, performance declined rapidly. A greater-than-average fuel capacity was standard, and this was the starting point for the Mustang's long range, and thus its eventual capability as an escort fighter. The superior range of the various P-51 models can be seen when compared to their contemporaries in the European theater. The British Spitfire Mark IX had a radius of 220 miles on internal fuel, sufficient to reach northeast France and the Low Countries. The American P-38H Lightning offered a little additional range on internal fuel, with a radius of 225 miles and covering the same general area. The P-47C Thunderbolt possessed an increased combat radius of 320 miles on internal fuel only. The Mustang P-51C doubled this radius to 650 miles, sufficient to reach into virtually all of France and much of Germany. With the addition of drop tanks, the combat radius of the Spitfire Mark IX was boosted to 480 miles. The equivalent radius for the P-38H was 550 miles, providing coverage over all of Denmark and much of France and Germany. The P-47C could roam out to a combat radius of 625 miles, just short of the range of the P-51C on internal fuel alone. All of these types were eclipsed by the P-51D. Carrying maximum internal and external fuel, it could range out to an incredible 1,100 miles from base. The machine gun armament was also impressive. Under the nose were two 50-caliber machine guns, while the wing leading edges held two further 50-caliber guns plus four 30-caliber guns. The new fighter entered British service in April 1942 as the Mustang Mark I. The Mustang Mark I-A switched to an armament of four 20mm cannon in the wing. The new fighter was quickly adopted by the U.S. Army Air Force, which required 150 P-51s similar to the Mustang Mark I, and 310 P-51As, similar to the Mark I-A. The addition of 2 underwing hardpoints opened the way, in later Mustang models, to fighter-bomber operations. Each hardpoint could carry one 500-pound bomb or a drop tank of up to 150-gallon capacity. Napalm tanks were later added to the Mustang's weapons inventory. The Mustang also boasted superior speed. It was about 30 miles per hour faster than the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, which used the same engine. It was even faster than the Spitfire Mark IV, which had a more powerful engine. Because of the single-stage supercharger in the Allison engine, the most important failing of the early Mustangs was poor performance at altitude. British work to replace the Allison engine with a modified version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin had shown significant promise. The Merlin was eventually built in the United States as the Packard V1650, which incorporated a supercharger intercooler as well as improved coolant and oil radiators and produced more thrust. Seen here in the form of a rare 2-seat conversion trainer model, the TP-51, the Mustang was notable for its very clean lines, in combination with a powerful V12 engine and 4-blade propeller. This meant high speed and good fuel economy. This aircraft is based on the earlier type of fuselage, with a framed canopy faired into the base of the fin by a full-depth rear fuselage. The aircraft was 32 feet 3 inches long. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built in the United States by Packard as the V1650, drew its air through an inlet below the fuselage. The engine delivered more than 1,480 horsepower. The spent gases of each of the engine's 12 cylinders were discharged by ejector exhaust stubs, which produced a small amount of thrust. With a track of 11 feet 10 inches, the main landing gear units gave good stability on the ground. These units were designed to retract inward, under hydraulic power, into bays in the underside of the wing roots and the lower fuselage. When the units were retracted, these bays were completely covered to reduce drag. For the same reason, the tail wheel retracted into a door-covered bay under the rear fuselage. The all-metal tail unit was a cantilever structure with a fin and rudder, and a tail plane carrying 2 elevators. All 3 moving surfaces had an inset trim tab, so that the aircraft could be trimmed to fly straight and level without any coarse movement of the primary control surfaces. The duct under the central and rear fuselage accommodated the engine coolant radiator. Cold free-stream air entered the front of the unit and passed over the radiator, much of whose heat was thereby transferred to the air. This last was then exhausted through a variable flap under the back of the duct. The heated air provided an additional measure of thrust and also helped smooth the airflow under the rear fuselage, further reducing drag. In its pure fighter form, the Mustang had major fuel tanks in the fuselage, as well as in the wing. In the definitive P-51D, this provided 269 gallons of internal fuel and could be supplemented by up to 220 gallons of fuel in a pair of underwing tanks for the excellent maximum range of 2,300 miles after takeoff at a maximum overload weight of 12,100 pounds. Spanning 37 feet and 1/3 of an inch, the Mustang's dihedral wing was based on a very efficient laminar flow airfoil section, and on its trailing edge inboard flaps and outboard ailerons, the latter each with an inset trim tab. Later combat Mustang variants had a bubble canopy and cut-down rear fuselage to give the pilot a much improved field of vision. The sliding rear section also made it easier for the pilot to enter and leave the cockpit. In fighting Mustangs, The gun armament was installed in the leading edges of the wing.
The P-51 had 6 50 caliber guns, 3 mounted in each wing, but they had to be mounted outboard of the propeller arc so we wouldn't shoot the propeller away. We bore sighted those guns for about 300 yards out ahead of the pilot. So the firepower was concentrated at 300 to 400 yards.
The P-51 was initially given the name Apache by the U.S. Air Corps, but eventually they adopted the British name Mustang. The name Apache, however, would still be used on a variant of the Mustang. The British had found that the Allison engine Mustang was better suited to the low-level ground attack role. The Americans came to the same conclusion and ordered 500 of a low-level ground attack and dive bomber variant. This was designated the A-36A Apache, a beefed-up P-51A with pairs of hydraulically operated dive brakes above and below the redesigned wing. The Apache first entered combat during April 1943 in North Africa. After the invasion of Sicily, they were based on rough airstrips on the island. Often there were no fuel bowsers available, and the 100-grade gas had to be offloaded from trucks by hand and laboriously poured into the aircraft's fuel tanks. The A-36A's wings were fitted with shackles for 2 500-pound bombs. These too were loaded onto the wings by hand. The Apache was armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, 2 of these installed in the underside of the nose and 4 in the leading edges of the wings. Operating from these bases, they were highly effective in strikes against German positions on the Italian mainland. The A-36A proved highly successful in North Africa and also in the Italian theater of operations. The wide track of the landing gear really proved its worth when taking off or landing on these rough airstrips. The type was finally retired from European service in June 1944. Smaller numbers also fought in the China, Burma, India theater, but here the Apache was not as successful. The Apache's career in the CBI theater lasted up to the end of 1944. The Packard-built Merlin replaced the Allison V-1710 in the P-51B and C models. It drove a 4-blade propeller. Range was further boosted by the introduction of the 85-gallon tank in the fuselage behind the cockpit. In mid-1943, the British adopted the P-51B and C, which entered service as the Mustang Mark III. The combination of increased range and improved performance at higher altitudes opened the way for the Mustang to serve in the role of escort fighter. It was in this role that the Mustang would achieve its greatest utility. Bombers typically flew a circuitous route. This was designed to confuse the Germans on the intended target and also to avoid the worst flak and fighter concentrations wherever possible. The short-range fighters escorted the bombers in a series of relays to protect the bombers at the most critical points along their route. The longer-range fighters took up escort as the mission progressed.
And if you notice, all of the bombers had a circle, a square, or a triangle on the tail with a letter, an alphabetic letter in it. And we would be given the alphabetic letter and the triangle or the square, as the case may be, and we would cruise along the bomber stream until we found our assigned bomber groups. And then we would stay with them and set up escort over the bombers. We kept our speed up so we would have some advantage when the German fighters would attack. We would already be cruising at a fairly high rate of speed. But because we were escorting the bombers and they were much slower, we would weave over the bombers in a combat formation.
The one remaining operational limitation of the Mustang was its framed canopy, which restricted the pilot's rearward fields of vision.
The early P-51 had what we called a slab side. It was a very narrow cockpit, so you couldn't stick your head out and look behind you. But the Brits, bless their souls, they came out with what we call the Malcolm hood, which put a bubble on the side of the P-51 that you could stick your head out into. And it was a big improvement because you could never see too much. As a fighter pilot, you could never see too much. You know, you wanted to see if any enemy was coming up.
A large dorsal fin extension also became standard to overcome a handling problem at lower speeds when the gas tank to the rear of the cockpit was full. Changes to the armament were now 6 50 caliber guns in the wings, and the hardpoints were upgraded to 1,000 pounds each. Production of the definitive P-51D was no fewer than 8,156. There were also 1,500 of the P-51K, which differed from the D model only in its propeller. Using its internal fuel and underwing drop tanks, the Mustang had the range to escort the bombers to targets deep in Europe.
We had two 91-gallon tanks in the wings and an 85-gallon tank, one 85-gallon tank, but behind the pilot. And we had external fuel tanks also, which ranged in size from 90 gallons up to about 110 or 120 gallons. And the original tank, I think, was 120, but we also used some paper tanks that the Brits made. And they were just a one-way tank. When we went on an escort mission, and I think those might have been 110 gallons. So we had plenty of fuel in our P-51s. But we never brought the paper tanks back because by that time they were empty and we would just toggle them off and drop them.
Even at maximum range, with the rear fuselage tank emptied and the drop tanks released, the Mustang was still a match for the German fighters operating at shorter range over their own base areas. After combat, the Mustang could return home on the rest of its internal fuel. At the beginning of September 1943, Allied forces landed on the Italian mainland. As they advanced up the boot of Italy, Foggia and several other airfields were captured. These bases could now be used by the Allied air forces. The southern front of the Allied air war was about to begin. Ploiești in Romania was one of the Axis power's primary sources of crude oil, and therefore a strategic target for Allied air attack. Unescorted single, small, and medium-sized missions had been flown in June 1942 and in August 1943 from North Africa. These had inflicted only limited damage, but warned the Axis powers that Ploiești would be a major target in the future. In 1944, a major effort was made to destroy this strategic target. Between April and the beginning of June, Ploiești was targeted by 8 separate raids in a sustained campaign to destroy the target and cripple Axis oil production. Even with fighter escorts, Ploiești was a target from hell. A surprise approach was impossible. The target area was heavily defended by fighters and by a great concentration of anti-aircraft guns. Some of these were mounted on special trains below the bombers' flight paths. The bombers, flying fortresses and liberators, were, as always, escorted by P-51D fighters all the way to and from the target. Both P-51 pilots and bomber crews were on constant alert for the threat of attack by Luftwaffe fighters.
The combat formations we flew allowed us to look off into the distance to see any enemy aircraft, or bogies as they were called, and they were bogies until they became identified as enemy aircraft. Then they became bandits. Now we saw bogies happen to be P-47s later on and other P-51 groups. But when they became identified as ME-109s or 190s, they were bandits. Mm-hmm. So it was our job to keep the bandits from shooting down our friendly bombers.
Watch it, fellows. 109's 10 o'clock. Yellow leader to blue flight. Looks like they're trying to lead us away from the bombers.
Green leader here. You're right. Here comes another. 9 o'clock.
Blue leader here. Blue flight drop tanks. Yellow and green flight stay up for cover.
The bombers' 50 caliber machine guns were inferior to the Messerschmitt's cannon in range and weight of fire. The best opposition was provided by the Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter. Though older in concept than the Mustang, the Bf-109 was still a good fighter, and when well handled, was a formidable opponent. The Bf-109G model was slower than the P-51D, but was notably well armed with 3 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Whenever the Bf-109Gs managed to break through the Mustang screen, they could inflict a heavy toll on the bomber formations. American pilots soon learned that in combat with the 109, their aircraft had superior speed under all level flight conditions. In terms of climb, the Mustang was superior to the 109 above 25,000 feet and slightly inferior below 20,000 feet. The two aircraft were generally similar in a zoom climb, but the Mustang's dive acceleration was significantly greater, allowing the Mustang to break away easily. The two fighters' rate of roll was similar, but the German fighter was inferior when the American pilot made swift changes in direction, and the Mustang always enjoyed the advantage of a smaller turning circle. Allied planning for the defeat of Germany was based on a massive amphibious assault across the English Channel in mid-1944, followed by an offensive into the heart of Germany. The commander-in-chief was American officer General Dwight D. Eisenhower, with a British deputy, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder. For the invasion, General Sir Bernard Montgomery commanded the land forces, and Air Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh Mallory the air forces. For the D-Day assault, the Allies assembled a huge force of tactical warplanes. Among the most important were the 12 Mustang squadrons of the U.S. 8th Air Force based in eastern England. At Debden were the 3 squadrons of the 4th Fighter Group, while at Falmere were a further 3 squadrons of the 339th Group. To the west was Steeple Morden, home of the 3 squadrons of the 355th Group, while the 357th was at Leiston, again with 3 squadrons. The Mustang was now in the prime of its career, with most of the German air strength in France and the Low Countries scheduled for destruction before D-Day. It was in the fighter-bomber role that the Mustang was to make its major contribution during the D-Day invasion. The Allies carefully planned the overall destruction of the communications and transport system used by the Germans in northern France and the Low Countries. Particular attention was paid to destroying all the bridges across the River Seine between Paris and Normandy. The Allied air campaign targeted not only roads, railroads, and waterways, but also telephone and telegraph services. The object was to isolate German coastal formations from each other and from their higher command and control elements. In this way, the Allies could ensure that the Germans would find it impossible to move major reinforcements into the area targeted by the Allied invasion. All Allied aircraft at the time of the Overlord landings and during the subsequent land campaign in Normandy were specially marked to aid identification. The markings were broad parallel stripes of black and white around the inner parts of the wing and on the fuselage to the rear of the cockpit. It was appreciated that the situation in Normandy would initially be precarious, and in such circumstances, Allied aircraft gunners on land and at sea, as well as other Allied aircraft, could become somewhat trigger-happy. Prior to D-Day, heavy and medium bombers based in Great Britain attacked critical targets in the German transport system. Additionally, Mustang squadrons roamed far and wide striking specifically at the railway system in France. The Germans were aware that the invasion was imminent, but did not know where or precisely when it would happen. The land preparations for D-Day were enormous. The Allies had assembled in Britain the U.S. First and the British Second Army. At the end of May 1944, they began to move to their embarkation ports on England's south coast. To ensure that they were in their correct battle formations when they landed on the Normandy coast, their orders called for thousands of troops and their equipment to be loaded onto the landing ships in precisely the right sequence. Powerful naval forces provide escort during the crossing and gunfire support during the landings. Early on June the 6th, the two Allied armies stormed ashore to secure a lodgment in Operation Overlord. Though initial German resistance was in places heavy, particularly on the American beaches, the landing areas and the beachhead were secured. However, a new threat now emerged. On June 13th, the first of hundreds of German V-1 flying bombs, the Doodlebugs, were launched against England. These 400-mile-an-hour jet-powered weapons had an 1,870-pound warhead and were exceptionally difficult for the Allied anti-aircraft guns to shoot down. American Mustangs and British Spitfires were tasked with downing the V-1s before they could reach their targets. This mission was both difficult and dangerous. The V-1s were exceptionally fast, and the warhead also tended to explode in mid-air when hit by gunfire. By the beginning of the Normandy campaign, the German Luftwaffe in northern France had been reduced to a pitiful remnant of its earlier strength. The Germans were unable to intervene in any significant manner above the Overlord landings, and the Allies had total air supremacy over the battlefield and the maritime approaches to it. Gradually, the Germans were able to increase their strength in the air. Though they were never able to challenge the Allies' overall air supremacy, they could at times make themselves felt. By this stage in the war, however, production of German warplanes was outstripping the availability of fuel and experienced and capable pilots, as well as other aircrew. The fighter units of the U.S. 8th and 9th Air Forces, on the other hand, had the latest equipment, an abundance of fuel, and all the pilots they needed. Moreover, the American pilots were now highly experienced and skillful practitioners of the art of air combat. It was almost inevitable that the Mustang pilots gained the upper hand in air combat, building up their own victory tallies while whittling away the number of useful pilots left to the German fighter arm. In the Mustang, American fighter pilots had the ideal weapon. The P-51 was a true multi-role fighter. In air-to-air combat, the Mustang was generally superior to anything that the Germans could deploy against it in 1944 and 1945. Mustang 650 caliber machine guns, with 1,880 rounds of ammunition, caused havoc amongst the remaining German aircraft that rose to meet the Allied onslaught. The U.S. 8th Army Air Force in Europe produced some of the highest-scoring air aces of the Second World War. The greatest Mustang ace was Major George Preddy. In the summer of 1944, his unit, the 328th Fighter Squadron, part of the 352nd Fighter Group, was based at Bodney in England. Preddy's greatest day was the 6th of August, when, in his P-51D, Cripes a Mighty III, he shot down 6 German aircraft. In total, Preddy was credited with 26.83 air-to-air victories. When several pilots share in a victory, they were each credited with part of the kill. The addition of these parts to a pilot's tally of personal victories often resulted in apparently strange totals. Illustrative of this is Preddy's figure of 26.83 victories. Following the tradition of many fighter aces, A record of the number of kills was painted on the port side of the aircraft's forward fuselage. On Christmas Day 1944, Major George Preddy was shot down and killed in a friendly fire incident by an American anti-aircraft battery near Liège in Belgium. From the 6th of June to the end of August 1944, when the breakout of the U.S. First Army from Normandy signaled the start of the Allied race across France, the Mustang was a key element of the fight for Normandy. The Mustang flew almost wholly in the ground attack role, attacking German fixed installations and also targets of opportunity, such as trains and motor transport of all types. The work was important, for a well-timed attack could wreak total havoc on a column of trucks carrying men and essential supplies, or destroy a trainload of armor, artillery, and ammunition. The lack of air targets meant that Mustang pilots often attacked German airfields, and always with great vigor.
The Germans did not take kindly to us shooting up their ground targets, so they had a lot of anti-aircraft fire around airfields, for example. Tremendous amount of 88s and 20 millimeter, 40 millimeter cannon, and every ground guy with a rifle was a possible problem, you know. Anti-aircraft fire was intense. We lost more pilots and airplanes to ground fire than we did in air-to-air combat.
The increasing number of German aircraft destroyed on the ground rather than in the air led the Air Corps to categorize air-to-air and air-to-ground victories separately. George Preddy, for example, was credited with 5 air-to-ground kills in addition to his 26.83 air-to-air kills. On July 25th, the United States First Army on the extreme right of the Allied positions in Normandy broke out of the lodgment from Saint-Lô to Avranches. This allowed the new U.S. Third Army to the south and then the east to completely destroy the German positions in northwest France. By the 25th of August, Paris had been liberated to great celebrations. At the same time, the Allies had reached the line of the River Seine. Allied fighter bombers, including the Mustang, had done incalculable damage to German troops, armored fighting vehicles, and other weapons. In the process, they had all but destroyed the German 7th Army in the Falaise pocket. The most successful of the various Mustang fighter groups in the European theater was the 354th Fighter Group, known as the Pioneer Mustang Group. It was the first to receive the P-51B for operational service. The 354th Fighter Group was activated in December 1942 with the Bell P-39 fighter. The group was informed only after its arrival in Great Britain in November 1943 that it was to re-equip with the P-51B, and its 3 squadrons were to operate from Boxted in the English county of Essex. An element of the 9th Air Force, the 354th Fighter Group provided long-range escort for the U.S. heavy bombers. Up to the middle of May 1944, the group was instrumental in developing the Mustang for long-range escort on raids deep into German territory. Although officially assigned to the 9th Army Air Force, the 354th was actually controlled operationally by the 8th Fighter Command of the 8th Air Force. This was because most of the unit's missions were as escorts for the 8th's B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers. On the 25th of April, during an escort mission to Mannheim, the group claimed 18 aircraft destroyed, 5 probably destroyed and 31 damaged, with the loss of only 2 Mustangs. Yet another high score came on the 28th of May, during an air battle near Magdeburg, where 19.5 German aircraft were credited as shot down. An increasing number of ground attack missions were flown in the period leading up to D-Day, each Mustang carrying 2 250 or 500-pound bombs for attacks on targets such as rail installations. On D-Day itself, the 354th escorted Douglas C-47 Skytrains, towing gliders for the landing on the Kothatan Peninsula near Cherbourg, and in the following days patrolled the lodgement area. Components of the 354th Fighter Group moved to an advanced landing strip at Criqueville in the Normandy bridgehead between the 13th and 17th of June. During its time in Kent, the group had lost 23 aircraft, but was credited with destroying 68 German planes. Now the fighter group helped the Allies in the drive across France by flying close support, armed reconnaissance, fighter sweep, dive bombing, strafing, and escort missions. In September, the group flew missions in support of the Market Garden airborne assault in the Netherlands. It also destroyed many German barges, locomotives, vehicles, buildings, and troops to support the Allied assault on the Siegfried Line. The fighter group also participated in the Battle of the Bulge, supporting ground forces and flying armed reconnaissance missions. It aided the ground forces in their advance to and the crossing of the River Rhine by providing both air cover and close ground support. When the war against Hitler ended in May 1945, the group was based at Herzogenaurach in Germany. By this time, the group had been officially credited with 701 air-to-air victories, the largest number for any U.S. fighter group in the European theater in World War II. In Europe, the Allies were now driving through the Low Countries towards the German border. The terrain was particularly difficult because of the many canals and rivers that crisscrossed the landscape. Many of these had to be bridged or assaulted in small boats, which made progress slow, but the German frontier was now in sight. The once mighty Luftwaffe was now in its death throes, as it vainly tried to stem the constant Allied attacks. Most of its best pilots were dead or in captivity, and even if there were the pilots to fly them, many of its remaining aircraft were grounded because of the chronic shortage of fuel and spare parts. Those German aircraft that did manage to get airborne now fell easy prey to the Allied fighters, particularly the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe's losses were horrendous. With total air superiority now achieved, the Mustangs were free to strike at the Germans' remaining airfields. Any aircraft parked out in the open, and even those in their hangars, were subjected to relentless strafing. Unable to get back onto their bases, many German fighters were forced to crash land in the open country. In the spring of 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine River and advanced into Germany. Much of the fighting was now in the towns and cities of Hitler's proclaimed Thousand-Year Reich. With the fighting shifting to urban areas, there was little or no call for air support from the Mustangs. The fighting instead now involved bitter house-to-house warfare by the Tommies and GIs. By now, the Allies had total air supremacy over Germany. Anything that moved on the already crippled German transport system was ferociously attacked. There were so few strategic targets left standing that the Allied heavy bombers were now used tactically to support the Western Allies advancing from the west and the Soviets closing in from the east. Germany was in the grip of a death vice from which it could not escape. Finally, in the middle of April, the Russians launched their offensive against Berlin. 2 weeks later, Hitler was dead and Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. From 1944, the Mustang also saw service against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. Here, the P-51D was supplemented by the lightened P-51H, of which 555 were delivered for service in the bomber escort role. Also in service was the F-6D, the armed reconnaissance variant of the P-51D. On January 11th, Major William B. Shomo of the 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron took off from Mindoro Island. He and his wingman were tasked with reconnoitering northern Luzon in support of the U.S. Sixth Army's invasion of the Philippines. Flying above the Cagayan River, they encountered a Japanese bomber protected by 12 fighters. Shomo immediately attacked the formation and shot down the leading Japanese aircraft, which exploded in flames. He then maneuvered onto the side of the formation and shot down another fighter before attacking from the other flank and scoring yet another hit. He next attacked the bomber, which crashed, and before he was finished, downed 3 other fighters. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb, also scored 3 kills. It was the most conspicuous success of the Mustang in the Pacific in a single sortie.
As they came in over Mindoro Strip, the lead pilot, Captain Arthur Shomo, executed a victory roll, indicating that he had destroyed an enemy plane. Ground crews looked up surprised. But Shomo had only begun. He went around again, did another victory roll, and the men on the ground started counting. 2 planes downed. When Captain Shomo executed his 3rd and 4th victory roll, it brought out the brass. By the time he was making the 5th, the 6th, and 7th roll, no one would believe it. 7 victories seemed impossible. He was just showing off. No, Captain Shomo did not show off. On 7 April 1945, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. The citation read in part, Major Shomo's extraordinary intrepidity in destroying 7 aircraft in one action is unparalleled in the Southwest Pacific area.
One of the hardest fought operations of the Pacific War was the capture of the strategically important island of Iwo Jima between the 19th of February and the 26th of March 1945. The Japanese had built 2 airfields on the island and were in the process of constructing a 3rd. These airfields would be of vital importance to America. The fighting was bitter as U.S. Marines captured Mount Suribachi and drove the Japanese from the airfields onto the northern tip of the island. In U.S. hands, the airfields on Iwo Jima allowed Mustang fighters to escort the Boeing B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers operating from the Marianas during their strategic raids on the Japanese home islands. Not only would the island provide a base for the Mustang squadrons, it would give damaged B-29s an emergency base at which to land on their way back to the Marianas. But its main purpose was to provide fighter cover for the B-29s over Japan. On April 7, 1945, the first Mustang from Iwo Jima flew over Tokyo. By this stage of the war, Japan's defeat was inevitable, but the Japanese military still refused to surrender. The remaining Japanese pilots that flew against the Mustangs were mostly poorly trained and inexperienced. Additionally, the majority of the surviving Japanese fighter planes were technically obsolete. The Japanese tried with fanatical courage to attack the superfortresses, but on their way, the Japanese fighters had to get past the Mustangs, which shot them down in large numbers. As the Japanese effort against the American bombers failed, the Mustangs were again loosed against ground targets. This echoed the earlier situation in Europe, and the Mustangs enjoyed a comparable success, bringing home to the Japanese population that the war was truly lost. Using machine gun fire, bombs, unguided rockets, and napalm, the Mustangs swept over and destroyed large amounts of irreplaceable equipment and installations. They also struck at Japan's important ports and coastal shipping. Even for the long-legged Mustang, Pacific operations posed something of a problem. In 1944, therefore, the North American Aviation Company embarked on the development of a longer-range derivative, the P-52 twin Mustang. This offered all the advantages of 2 pilots, 2 engines, and a proportionately greater fuel load. The twin Mustang was, in essence, 2 lengthened P-51 fuselages, complete with their engines and port and starboard wing panels. These were connected by a new central wing section and tailplane. The central wing carried the fixed armament of 6 50 caliber guns. The port and starboard outer wings could carry 4 1,000-pound bombs. The first twin Mustang prototype flew on July 6, 1945, but the type was developed too late to see service in World War II. The P-51 Mustang played a critical role in the Allied victory in World War II. How important was that role, and how might the war have been fought differently if the Mustang had never been developed? The Mustang was a good general-purpose fighter. Its designer, North American Aviation, was a highly efficient producer. The plane's simple design and small number of variants made it an ideal candidate for mass production. This ensured that there was a steady supply of aircraft to replace those lost or damaged in combat and to expand Allied air forces. In the Pacific Theater, the P-51 Mustang was the only fighter with the range required to escort the B-29 bombers based in Saipan. Eventually, the success of the bombing campaign over Japan reduced the Japanese military's ability to replace the fighters it had lost attacking the B-29 bomber streams, and all but eliminated the threat to the bombers. Bomber losses would have been greater without escort, however, especially at the onset of the air war. But the course of the war, although lengthened, would not have been changed. In the European theater, however, the role of the Mustang is more complex. In its fighter-bomber role, the Mustang could have easily been replaced by the twin-engine P-31 Lightning and huge single-engine P-47 Thunderbolt. Both planes were truly formidable ground attack fighters. But in its primary role of escorting the bombers of the British-based 8th Air Force and Italian-based 15th Air Force, the Mustang was irreplaceable. Neither the Lightning nor the Thunderbolt had the range to escort the bombers deep into Germany and German-held Central Europe. Only the Mustang offered this capability, and without the Mustang, it is arguable that the U.S. Air Force's single most important strategic objective, precision daylight raids to destroy the industries on which the German armed forces were wholly reliant, would have been impossible. In such circumstances, the bombers would have been limited to the shorter operating radius of the Lightning and Thunderbolt fighters, making American bombing more a tactical than a strategic weapon. This would inevitably have lengthened the war against Germany and resulted in much higher losses of bombers and their crews. This then was the P-51 Mustang. Irreplaceable. It was certainly the finest American fighter of World War II, and remains to this day a legend of air combat.